Ruben for picking me up at the Cartagena airport and giving me a tour of Cartagena before driving up. So I've now been to 3 cities in Colombia. So if anybody needs a tour, I'm here for that. I'd also like to, before we get started, understand a little bit about you. So I just want to ask a couple of questions. First, you know this is about CMAT and essence. That's what I'm talking about. But just with a show of hands, how many people know nothing about essence? This is your first exposure to it.
¿Quieres saber cuánta gente sabe algo sobre esencia? ¿Quién sabe algo? ¿Quién ha estudiado algo sobre el tema que vamos a tratar, esencia?
Hands up again, let me just see that. Okay, all right. Now let me ask, how many people have read about it, they have an idea about it, but they want to learn more?
Los que sepan algo y que quieran saber más.
So next question, are there people really into it? That, I mean, you're using it, or you're teaching it, or how about that level?
Es que hayan enseñado, los que sepan bastante.
They can come up and give my presentation. Okay, so that's good. The other thing that I think Carlos might have mentioned, that we talked last night on the phone, and I was originally set up to talk for an hour and a half or so, and then there'd be a break, and Carlos would talk, and then there's a workshop where you could ask questions. And after we talked, and he told me my slides were going to be in Spanish, which I thought that'll work interesting. So I have to keep them down here in English. But I said, well, let's just let people ask questions as we go. And so we're kind of integrating the workshop right in. I think that'll work far better, and then I know that you're getting what you need to get. That's the important thing, that you're understanding the concepts as we go through that. So what this is all about is ask questions. If you're not comfortable asking in English, ask it in Spanish, and Carlos will translate for me.
Ok, perfecto. Déjame aclarar este punto, Paul. Entonces, la idea es que... ¿Sí más, Paul?
I think you just said more than I did. And so last year, when I spoke in Medellin, I talked about a problem that the software engineering community faces. In fact, for the first 20 minutes, I said I wasn't going to talk about essence or CMAT at all because I wanted you to understand the problem. And that's what I did. And then we went in to look at CMAT that are going to happen. How do you handle those, especially under the pressure of a project? They happen frequently. So that's the context that I want to give this presentation under. And I've broken it down, and you might want to explain this in a minute, but I've broken this down into really 3 areas. Since we did have quite a few hands that went up, this is your first exposure, I want to take about the next 20 minutes to really give you some basis of essence. But I'm going to do it a little differently. I'm just not going to give you pure essence. I'm going to say, here's the fundamentals of what's in essence, but I want to also talk about what's different about essence. Why is this any different than any other model like the CMMI or another framework like Scrum? I want to talk about that. And I want to talk about some of the confusions people have, the misunderstandings. So I'm going to do that for the first 20 minutes, roughly. And then I want to go into some examples. We've been working for the last couple of years on an Essence User's Guide, and it's going to be released soon. I'm going to give you some real examples, concrete examples, on how practitioners can use Essence. That gets us about halfway through. It'll probably be an hour and a half from now with the going backward. Then I want to get into something that's more interesting in my own research and my own things I've done with my own clients. And I want to get people to think our thoughts I have on how we can help these organizations give practitioners more what they need so that they get more help. And I'm going to give a number of examples from that. So that's kind of where we're going. You want to...
Listo, entonces, pues el asunto será una presentación no problem.
So, some fundamentals of Essence and how it's different. First thing, it's a thinking framework. Now, how many people have heard that before? Just show of hands. Have you heard of it as a thinking framework? The reason I want to stop and say some things about this is one way. It is different. You don't hear about other frameworks that are provided as a thinking framework. So what do we mean by it as a thinking framework? The best way, I'm going to want you to explain this, and the best way that I like to think about this is I've got a friend. I've known him for many years. He's a colleague. He's also a client of mine. And he's a real practical engineer. He's an electrical engineer by trade. But he's a program manager, and he's a real good systems engineer. And he's not real big on models and defined processes. But he's really good at reviewing things I give him. And I actually gave him some of the work that I was doing when I was writing my last book. And I said, take a look at this. What do you think of it? And he goes, if it's anything like the CMMI, I don't want to hear about it. I go, just take a look at it. And it had essence in it. It had descriptions. He comes back to me and he goes, you know, this essence thing has got a great deal of context with respect to problem solving. And when I heard that, I go, wow. Context with respect to problem solving. I'm going to refer to this again, but I want people to think about this because this is really, he hit it right on the head. He looked at this model and he said to himself, wow, I can solve real problems on real projects. People don't say that about the other models. So this is a very important starting point.
El asunto es que, pues,
so other ways it's different. So it's going to help us with problem solving. It's different from other models like the CMMI and Lean Six Sigma are two models I use in my business. The CMMI, I'm like steeped in it. I've been to all kinds of classes. I've got the 3 volumes of 600-page books. I'm a Lean Six Sigma black belt. It took me about 250 hours of study plus going through a 5-hour examination. My whole point of this is consultants go into organizations that use these tools, CMMI and Lean Six Sigma. It's about looking at a project or an organization from the outside using these tools. And what I like to say, what Essence is, it's for practitioners to look at a project from the inside. I don't know of a lot of other models like that. Now, you might come back and go, well, isn't Scrum a nice framework, a nice model that's for practitioners that we can use on the inside? And the answer is yes. But here's an important distinction. If you look at Scrum, Scrum is a set of practices. They're good practices that say, do a planning meeting at the beginning of an iteration. So we get together and we plan. Do a daily stand-up every day. Nice practice. Do a retrospective at the end. That's good. These are all good practices and people like this. But Scrum doesn't help you with respect to when you're doing a progress assessment. Okay? I'm going to hold these daily stand-ups. I'm going to tell you where I'm at. Scrum doesn't go any further into really helping you decide whether you have a problem, how you're doing against your schedule. In the retrospective, Scrum doesn't go any farther in terms of helping you in terms of where to look for issues. How are we doing? How do I know what problem I might run into? Scrum doesn't go any deeper than that. What you're going to find with Essence will help you ask the right questions to go deeper and find real issues. So it can work. One of the phrases we use is Essence can power things like Scrum. It's not in conflict with it, it's not an alternative, but it can work together with it for the practitioner. So these are some of the ways that it's different.
Okay. Ahí la idea es que, a diferencia de diferentes entornos,
Okay. All right. So, Essence contains 7 alphas. The alphas are the essential things we work with. Alphas always exist. Now, some people might say, all right, so they always exist. You know, what are we talking about? If I give you the words The alphas are things that you use in normal language. It doesn't sound like something different. You're talking about things like requirements, stakeholders, opportunity, software system, way of working, work, team. These are natural words. They always exist. So some people might say, so what? If they always exist, what's so great about having some model that where the things always exist? Here's a key point. What doesn't always exist, and where the value that Essence brings is not just in the recognition of the 7 alphas, but in the states and checklists that go with it. Because the states and checklists don't always exist. And what they are is a model, it's a framework to help you think about what does it take? What state am I in? Why am I not in the next state? And the checklists are things that help you ask the right questions to say, what is it going to take to get to that next state? Now, some people go, we've been doing checklists forever. CMMI does checklists. So what's different with your checklists? And they say, the states make this model look waterfall. We want to be iterative. So what I'm about to now talk about is I'm going to give you some examples on how this model is not waterfallish. That's coming up next. And then I'm going to go in and give you some examples. I talked a lot about this last year in Medellin, but just give you 1 or 2 examples on how the checklists are really different and really stimulate that discussion to help you really get to meaningful issues. Another point I just make quick on this, when some people go, why did you pick a funny name like alpha? Why didn't you, since they're all things we know, why don't we just call them requirements and stakeholders and opportunity? Why do we have to call them alpha? And the reason is we wanted to pick a different name, that even because these always exist, there is something different going on here. Because it is actually not a good thing to think about, because some people think about, well, the alphas is just an abstract work product. And we actually used to think that when we started to say that's not a good way to think about this. Because where people got in trouble with the CMMI model was we got overly focused on the work products and we missed the goal. And what the alpha does is it gets you away from thinking about the work product and gets you thinking about the goal. And are we hitting the goal so that the work product doesn't just become building a document? And that's a key distinguisher. That's why we picked a different name.
Bueno, yo creo que de esta parte pues que nos está explicando.
So has anybody lost yet? Any questions?
¿Preguntas? ¿Nadie tiene preguntas? ¿Sí? ¿Por allá?
¿Por qué se consideraron solamente esos 7 alfas? Pues, ¿por qué 7 y por qué eso como tal?
What's the reason why we have only 7 alphas and no more alphas?
Okay, good question. Remember what we're trying to do here. This is universal. We had to consider all software engineering. By the way, there's other initiatives now going on where people are looking at extending this to systems engineering and enterprise systems and hardware engineering. But what we set out for is we said, because Ivar even said, let's do this for software engineering and eventually we can extend it. But we also had to look at all the domains of software engineering, embedded applications, life-critical web applications. And we had people involved from all of these domains. So we said, let's make sure we pick kernel elements that are universal and everybody gets. Now, could we have added more? Sure. And I'm going to talk about one later. There could be other ones added. And you can add more alphas. These are the kernel alphas. Alphas can be added. Right? So the reason there's only 7, and this is really interesting because the reason there's only 7 is we wanted to keep it small. We wanted to keep it so people could learn it in the university. You could come into industry and everybody knows the 7. If we made it too big, it would have been harder to keep in your head. And I'm a firm believer that we want practitioners to be able to keep it in their head and use it every day. So we wanted to keep it reasonably small. There's research been done that you can keep about 3 to 7 things in your head at once. So that kind of gives you some of the why it's small and why we kept it at 7.
Okay, este es un entorno que aquí vamos it was not clear. Why 7, not 6, not 5?
It could have been 5. Could have turned. We didn't pick a number and say 7. We had the working groups started thinking about this, and we had other candidates, and it just turned out to be 7. And also, I would say it's interesting that most of the states, there were 6. There's one that's 5, but we didn't set that as a number. We just said what makes sense. If some of them turned out to be more and some of them turned out to be less, it was just, and again, this was consensus of people that were on the working groups. So 7 wasn't a magic number.
El número 7 salió de los grupos de trabajo.
Actually, those of us who have gone back and looked at it think it's a darn good model, but we do see certain things like redundancies in it. So there will be evolutions of this. There will be improvements going forward. So there's a saying by George Box, all models are wrong, some are useful. And I think that works here. It's a very useful model. It's not a perfect model.
Mi pregunta es, ¿qué alcances y hasta dónde ha llegado la metodología en este tiempo que se ha trabajado?
Doing in the community with Simon.
How long is that going to go on?
How long? Yeah.
Okay. I envision that Essence, as we have it today, is going to evolve a little bit in terms of some changes to the OMG going forward. We can find a way to everybody agree on the kernel ideas, and then we start just making visible the differences. We can save people an incredible amount of time. You can see what's different in this guy's method than that person's method. That's going to go on. That's really the power of where this is going, so that we don't have to, when Barry Beam or Alistair Coburn goes out and writes this huge book, we can see clearly what their discriminating value is on top. I see that going on for 20, 30 years.
La idea es que hemos alcanzado hasta ahora. Paul, we don't see at this moment many practices, many methods represented in the CMOD kernel. I think the question is related more to this, because we still have the essence, like the work of some people working,
the kernel itself.
Yeah, and the representation of practices and methods. Estoy tratando de explicarle detrás how many people are behind these ideas, using these ideas, making alive these ideas.
So this is the hard part, because we built the kernel, people built it, the framework is there. We're now going to be coming out. We have regular meetings. I would mention the user's guide. I'm going to give you examples. Every week we have meetings with volunteers get together. We're building the user's guide. Also, there's a part of the user's guide which has guidance in how to write a practice on top. We haven't released that yet. So there aren't people writing practices yet because we haven't gone out and showed them how to do it yet. That's going to come out in the next year. Hopefully we're going to have it out by Christmas. And then we're going to have people like myself and Ian Spence and other people that have been involved in this go out and talk about how to write practices and the value of writing practices. And then we have to stimulate the world to write practice. Take your favorite practice, express it in the language, and share it with the world. We have to tell people the value and why they want to do that. We're also, I just got through also working on the
Yo tengo aquí varios que son voluntarios obligatorios. I'm forcing people to work in this.
Okay. So actually I'm going to talk about this if I ever get far enough into my slides, but I'm going to jump a little bit ahead because it ties into this. Because you're asking about the vision of the practices on top. And I was going to, you get these cards from Ivory Operations website. We're going to update these cards. This is the essence on the cards. And in the cards we have the 7 alphas. And I'll explain why I'm bringing these out now. But in the cards, you can find there's 7 alpha cards, which just describe each of the alphas in the states. And then there's state cards, right? So the essence of software engineering is in a card deck. Now, here's the interesting thing. You see in companies now, where they have their practices expressed in these huge documents, and people can't find anything. How many people have actually been out in industry that are practitioners, that have gone into companies and you've written software? And you see a show of hands on that?
Hagan software, practicantes de software, you're searching for practitioners.
Yes,
Practitioners, people working day by
Coders,
day.
testers, analysts.
Analistas, programadores, desarrolladores,
So we got
arquitectos.
we got a number of you out here. Now, I was a practitioner for many years. I wrote lots of code. For 15 years when I started, I wrote code in various languages, and I even went back when new languages came out like Java and Merc. I know what happens in companies, and every company's different. They express their practices differently. They give you these big documents. The big companies give you these big documents. You come in and they say, here's the way we want you to operate. And most practitioners go, all this documentation doesn't help me get my job done. What you're going to see, where we're trying to go with this vision, is here's essence. And when you see the guidance we're going to give you on how to express practices and patterns, the way I like to think of it is we're doing it with cards again. And we're going to have very simple cards to help you express your practices on top of the kernel. So when you go into a company, here's the vision. You go to school and you learn this one. And everybody comes out of school, we all know this one. And so you go into a company and we can talk this language. But where we want the companies to go is to have another card deck that sits on top of this. And it could be proprietary to the company, but this encapsulates the practices and patterns that this company, how it wants to operate. And so now we're all talking the same kind of language.
La idea es que
Juan nos comentaba la cantidad de alfas que se había decidido por consenso. Mi pregunta se basa en qué parámetros se tuvieron en cuenta para decidir en ese consenso, que esa sería la cantidad y el contenido definitivo de los alfas y los estados de estos diferentes alfas.
She's very worried about the number, the way in which we select 7 alphas. What are the parameters we used for selecting 7 alphas and 6 states for the alphas, and
So
it's only consensus?
That goes back to there was no, 7 is not a magic number. We weren't shooting for 7. But here's the interesting thing, and we're open to, and keep in mind, these are only the kernel alphas. And what that means is we believe on every software endeavor, these exist. You always have them. Now, you can argue that there could have been an 8th. And one of the ones I would say is, why didn't you have risk as an alpha? Risk always exists on every program. So why is it an alpha? First answer is, it could be. We could have made it an alpha, right? And a company can decide to add an alpha. One of the early case studies of people who use Essence, they've already agreed we can use their name, is Munich Re, one of the largest reinsurance companies in the world. They're all over, they're in North America, they're in Germany, they're all over the world. They're using it to get everybody on the same page. And they added funding. Funding is important. So they said funding is an alpha. That's fine, you can do that. I will talk later about why we decided not to put risk in the alphas, but it was a decision we made, all right? Because we felt there was a better way to handle risk.
And you were saying that the kernel may change, reach other disciplines in the future, right?
Add more disciplines?
Yes.
Yes.
So
I phrase it this way. The Essence kernel, I don't see the kernel for software engineering with major changes. Their refinements going to work. There will be what I like to use the phrase extensions. All right? It can be extended. Now there is one area that I was talking to Shion last night about this. There is one area that we probably have to change when we go to systems engineering. And it's the name of software system alpha. We probably will drop the name software and just make it system. And we have to rework the checklist because it's very software development centric right now.
in that case, the kernel itself can change the 7 alphas.
Yeah, there is a way through the OMG. They have this task force. And all we do is you can go in, anybody can do it. You can submit a request. You can go into the OMG website and submit a request for a change, and there's a group, a board, that looks at all the requests for change, and they make a decision. And it's going to stay reasonably stable over periods. You don't want this changing all the time, but there'll be a revision probably coming out within a year. And probably around this time next year will be the first 1.1. And there will be, I know there's going to be improved checklists in there. There's going to be some changes to activity spaces because we've had some concerns about certain things in there. But it's refinement. I don't right now perceive like an 8th alpha going in. That would be too dramatic. And we're really comfortable, and I'm open to hear people say why they think there should be an 8th or why there should be 6. But the 7 are really standing up well from the standpoint of nobody has said, well, on my project, opportunity doesn't exist. And nobody said that one of the 7 doesn't make sense. And although some people have said, why don't we add risk, we have a good reason for why we did it. And we say, if it's really important to you, go ahead and add it in your company. So I think we have a good story for the 7 right now that's holding together.
Thank you.
Another question.
Mi pregunta me la contestaron a la mitad. Me refiero
Of the checklist and the states, there's some criteria about that.
So the criteria for the alphas was, again, first of all, remember we have a group of volunteers that are representing different types, different domains of software. And we wanted to make sure we were covering all the domains. That was the first thing. It had to be universal. That's the first criteria. It works for all software engineering, large, small, complex, life-critical applications, web applications. It needs to be universal. Something was unique to one area and not another, it failed the criteria. So that's the first one. The checklists, there is certainly room for argument on a checklist being in this state versus the next state. All right, so there is that. You can argue some of that, but one of the key things to understand, and I want to make this point because a lot of people misunderstand it. They think it's waterfall. You don't just focus on the checklists in this state with blinders on. Frequently, depending on your life cycle and the way you're using it, frequently you're working checklists items that may be in states ahead of you. But the important thing is, in order to help assess in a consistent way, in order to say you've achieved a state, you have to be able to say, we've achieved all these checklists. Now I'm getting a little bit ahead of the presentation because I have some slides on this. But so does that mean that the project has to stop if we can't meet that checklist item? Well, this is why it's a thinking framework. We want teams to think about the checklist item, but you have to do it. This goes back to my friends. It's a problem-solving framework. It gives you a lot of context. We want you to think about those checklists within your context. Some of those checklist items may not be important to you in the context of your endeavor, the nature of the work you're doing. So the team decides. So you look at it from that context. The criteria in hitting those checklist items was literally people's experience. What did those states mean? We came up with the states looking for things that were universal within the office, and then we came up with the checklist items looking for things that people felt were important. And they were, the volunteers literally just suggested things, and then we wordsmithed them. And another important point here, there are words in there that are, I mean, we went over, there was a lot of work to make the words consistent so that words are used in a certain way. You know, a team has a mission. The team has, and there's words in there like, you'll see the words agreed to, and you'll see the word sufficient. I'm going to talk about that in the next slide here if I ever get to it. But the words were very carefully chosen, which, by the way, is interesting, and hopefully the meaning translates into Spanish and into Russian. I work with Andre Beda, who's doing the translation of the Russian version, and we have a Chinese version. Hopefully we don't lose in the translation those words, because obviously we used English to build this. And we were really thinking hard about what the meaning was in those phrases. And here's another interesting point here. Some of the meaning is intentionally left ambiguous, so that the team figures out in the context that they're in what that means. Agreed to. You see agreed to all over the place, and you can immediately ask the question, agreed to by who? And the answer is, who's important for this to be agreed to in the context of your program? Right? So this is why it's a thinking framework. It's not a check the box. It's you have to think about this within the context. It gets teams to talk. I think that this is probably the biggest value of it. It helps teams get their conversation going.
El asunto, y ese sí se los puedo mencionar.
So this example is an example to show how the checklists in the states are not waterfall, which is a misperception that a lot of people have. But it also shows you how to use the checklists in a thinking framework, in a context. Okay? And I just added this in the last few weeks because this slide is based on a conversation that happened in one of our users guide meetings. And what happened was we were talking about the work alpha, and this is just 3 abbreviated checklists item from it. And someone looked at these checklist items and said, and this was, our volunteers come and go. We have some that have been there for a while and they leave, others come and they weren't there when the original checklists were built. And so one of the new volunteers looked at this and said, those checklist items are out of order. And my immediate response was, I said, there is no order. We intentionally did not order the checklists because we're not giving you a method. These are method agnostic. And as soon as you start to talk about order, you start to feel like a method. I'm telling you to do certain things. But then the comment was made, yeah, but certain things have a natural order. And when things have a natural order and you put them in the wrong order, it looks disorganized. It looks like you didn't have any thought. So we go, you're right. And I had been involved in the original development, and I was looking at it and I'm going, why didn't we do it that way? And I go, let's look a little closer at this. So we looked at them. We took a look at the previous state. And you look at the previous state prepared before work is started, and here there's another checklist in there that looks redundant with one of the checklists in the previous one. So if you look here where I circled this, work is broken down sufficiently for productive work to start. Well, that looks a lot like this checklist item over here under started that says work is being broken down into actionable work items with clear definition of done. So why in the world did we have two things that look like that? And all of a sudden the light went on and I recalled why we did this. Okay, so here's an example of using this in context. Let's assume your team is using Scrum. That's your context. You're doing 30-day sprints. Now, work prepared. The work is broken down sufficiently. Sufficiently is one of those words we left ambiguous for you to decide what it means in the context of your program. So if I'm doing Scrum, if I've taken work in the backlog and I've broomed it and I've broken it down enough so that the team knows what they can do for the first 30-day sprint, given your agile Scrum approach, the team decides that's sufficient. Now think about this. Suppose you're in a big company and you're in a life-critical application and they're saying we're doing RUP, we're doing waterfall, and we're only going through the cycle once. That team is not going to say that's sufficient because you're in a different context and you need to break the work down further. And here's a perfect example of applying a checklist. Now look what happens. We go to work started. Let's go back to the Scrum team. Okay, I've done it sufficiently. Then the next one is, okay, development work has been started. I'm into the sprint. Okay, it started. The work progress is being monitored. I'm holding my daily stand-ups. And when I finish the sprint, I do my planning for the next 30 days. I break it down more. That's why this is here. Work is being broken down into actionable work items with clear definition of done. So you see how this actually has in it an opportunity for the team to interpret it in an iterative non-waterfall example. But if you're in waterfall, you can also interpret it the other way.
El asunto, bueno,
We don't define or require a life cycle. Part of your context decision is you decide what your life cycle is. Is it iterative? Are you just going to go through everything once? So this is the point. You decide the chunk of work to apply it to. You can apply the model over and over and over to small chunks of work. Or you can apply it once through. That's the traditional one-time through life cycle. But if you do it only one time through, then you have to interpret the checklist item within that context.
Okay. Es un asunto.
We've kind of said this. The alpha states and checklists to help you assess progress and health of your endeavor and take action early to address real pain points. But what I want to really send the message, I think we've probably hit this, but again, this is one of those real discriminators. I don't know of another model that helps you do this. Scrum doesn't help you do this. Certainly the CMMI and Lean Six Sigma. Because the way to think about this is these states and these checklists, if we can all get on the same page and recognize we do have to look at the context, but if we get the right interpretation, we now have a way, and it's incredible to think we haven't had this before, we now have a way for projects to have some consistent framework for how to measure. Where are we? This is huge, because this is the biggest problem we see in Agile, because people don't assess progress in a consistent way. This is huge. If we can get people on the same page, understanding these, and we start measuring from some level of consistency, just as a communication vehicle.
La idea es que no hay ningún otro modelo, ningún otro...
Yeah, the other reason that I think this is really important, personal experience, that You know, some of these checklists you can look at and say they're kind of little things. They don't seem like big things. But if you look at projects, big projects that fail and they get way behind schedule, they have these big overruns, and you go back and you do the post-mortem, the root cause analysis. And I get called into projects to do this from the outset. It's incredible how they almost all come back to these little things that were missed early. And again, today, what happens, because practitioners don't have a frame of reference like this, practitioners are on the project and they look at it and they go, you know, something doesn't feel right. You know, the stakeholders aren't working with us, or the requirements are ambiguous, and we know things aren't good, but you don't have any real objective evidence to take to your manager and say, we got to fix this now, or this program is heading south. This can give practitioners that reference point to say, we have to fix this now so this project is successful. That's another huge thing. It doesn't exist today. That's what this gives you as practitioners.
La otra diferencia es como el hecho de fijar.
Hit this. You don't always move forward linearly. And we hit some of those things where I said you can be working ones out here. The other way to think about this, and again, this gets you out of the waterfall mindset. A reason you don't always move forward linearly is because when you apply the model, you have to look at it in terms of where you are. We're going back to the context thing. But the context of your project, and we're not just talking about things that are static, is as you move through your project, things change. People come and go. Some people leave the project, like the team members. That can change. The state of your requirements can change. Some stakeholders may be involved and then later they're not involved. So the point is, you could assess the states and have achieved a state at one point in time, and in 1 month, you fall back. So you have to keep assessing because conditions can change. Last year in Medellin, I talked a lot about how the checklists are different. And one way I express that is that they move beyond existence checks. And again, I work with a lot of companies. I help them achieve higher level CMMI ratings. Checklists are very big in companies that implement the CMMI, but I refer to the way a lot of companies meet these things is existence checks. And lead appraisers come in teams and they look, and you pass the check if certain things are there. I wrote a plan, check. I got a plan, it's there. I'm supposed to do peer reviews, check. I see the meeting notices, peer reviews are going on. This is the mentality. Things exist. But the issue is, you can be a CMMI level 5 company, and we know this because there's a lot of examples out there, and you can check the box that you're doing all these things in all the process areas and have horrific programs because you're not really getting to the goal. And this gets back to my point. This is about getting our focus on a successful endeavor, not just checking boxes. And so I gave multiple examples in Medellin. I just want to give you one here, an example that I used then to have you get the sense for how our checklists are different. There are some existence checks in there, but there's a lot of them that go much deeper, and you have to give thought to it. And if you look at the requirements coherent state, and you just pull out the one checklist item, conflicting requirements are identified and attended to. This is an incredible checklist item, because what it's saying is that, not that I just have, okay, I got a requirements document, there it is, check. Who knows if it's any good? I mean, who knows if it's got a bunch of ambiguous requirements? This checklist item says to the team, how good are these requirements? Can you build a product from them? Are you dealing with conflicting requirements? If there's conflicting requirements in there, is somebody out there resolving them? Addressing, this is a checklist item that helps us get to the root of many of the difficulties that teams have. They have bad requirements and they can't get their stakeholders to work with them. There's lots of checklists in there like this. So when you work with these checklists and you say, what does this mean? What's going on? and then you move forward and fix them. You're getting to the real issues, the goal. The goal isn't to hit a requirements document. That's not the goal. That's why we say with alphas, we're not focusing on the artifact. We're focusing on the goal. The checklists help you focus on the goal.
Pues yo creo que es bien claro.
There are also something called activity spaces, and there's 15 activity spaces. Activity spaces are the alphas are the essential things we work with. The activity spaces are the essential things we do. Activity spaces are not activities. We intentionally picked words that were kind of higher level that didn't get down to a specific method or practice. We like to think of them as containers for activities. So you can decide what activities and practices you want to follow and fill the buckets. Now, some people spaces. The first thing I like to tell people is you don't have to use the activity spaces. But some people like to have an activity view of their practices. You can write practices and just say, here's the goal. You need to have practices to help you move forward with your alphas. We want to progress the alphas. And you could say, and some companies do this, I don't care how you do it. The activities you follow are up to you. But other companies, and again, it gets back to the nature of your business, especially ones that are in life-threatening conditions, some of them want to put more rigorous activities and practices in place and say, we follow these activities, these activity flows. And so this is here for companies that want an activity view of their practices. Now, whether you use these or not, activities always exist. You have to do something to progress an alpha. Whether it's tacit or defined is up to you. So how light your practices are is up to the company. But each company needs to decide. You have to think about this. How qualified are your people? If you have very qualified staff and everybody knows what they're doing, maybe you don't have to write down a lot of the activities. They're good. But you need to think about when new people come in, how do they learn? Do people leave the company? How do we capture? So the degree to which you document your activities is up to you. The degree to which you fill the activity spaces. We also have 6 competencies. All right? And the competencies are the abilities needed. Each competency has 5 standard levels. Now, a lot of people aren't talking about the competencies, but I am going to, because I actually think the competencies may be one of the best items that Essence is bringing. Because if you look at, again, I go back and look at companies I've worked with, a lot of them focus on responsibilities, roles and responsibilities. You go into an organization, here's your title, here's your role, here's your list of responsibilities. That doesn't tell you whether you have the skills, the competencies to do that job. So a lot of the models that are out there, what companies do, they don't put a lot of effort into looking at competency needs. And we have 6 essential competencies. By the way, just like the alphas, and the activity spaces, you can add more. You can always add more if they're important in your context. But we're saying these 6 competencies are essential. All right? These are essential. And interestingly, there's 6 of them here. And in my experience, 2 of them, which are the ones that you're probably most familiar with, are the ones that don't really cause that big of a problem today. And again, this is my experience looking at what's happening. The 2 that we've actually done a pretty good job over the years in progressing and in getting better at are development and testing. Because we've gotten better methods to develop software, to design software. We've come up with ideas such as object-oriented design. People are better at architecting systems, and we're now automating testing. So there's been a lot of progress made in development and testing. The other four have not gotten the attention that they deserve. And the other 4 is where often when we have troubled projects where we see difficulty. And as we keep going on, I'm going to talk about stakeholder representation. It's a critical competency. that sometimes we get people that are called the stakeholder representatives and they don't have the competency to do it. I'm going to talk a little bit more about analysis. I'm going to talk about leadership. But I just want to throw one out right here. This is just almost like, maybe I will throw out a question here. You see two of them down there at the bottom, leadership and management. And so, one of the reasons we want the competencies is so that you can go in and assess how is your project with respect to the competencies? Do your people have the abilities that you need? So I would just like to ask people with a show of hands, how many people feel really comfortable if they're on a project, they can quickly say whether they have a leadership problem versus a management problem? Or do those sort of get confusing to people? Are they kind of the same? People got clear. How many people are really clear on the difference between leadership and management?
¿Quiénes tienen claridad completa sobre la diferencia entre liderazgo y gestión? Claridad completa sobre eso, ¿no?
How many people would think they need a little help here? So we don't have a lot of people that are clear on it, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll just throw this out, because I'm not going to talk about other slides. Management, and if you read the words, management is about managing work. Work is stuff. It's work items. It's coordinating the work. Remember the other one we looked at, it, breaking the work down. It's all about work. Leadership is about people. You lead teams. You manage work. So if you look at the definition of those, they align that way. When you have problems with moving the team alpha forward, it's usually a leadership problem. Is there somebody leading the team? If you have a problem with the work alpha and you're having trouble moving it forward, it's usually a management problem.
Bueno, en esta parte, pues...
Questions now, and with the questions you've been asking, that we might have hit some of these, but this will just solidify that. What if you can't meet a checklist item? Okay? This is what a common question that we get. So let's look at some examples. The Team Alpha seated state, there's a checklist item. Mechanisms to grow the team are in place. So a common question we get, well, what if management said, there's 5 of us on this team, and they say that's all you're going to get. We're a shortage of resources. We can't grow the team. So how do I meet that checklist item? Well, the answer is the team discusses it. The team says, do we know our mission? Do we know what we have to do? We got 5 of us here. Do we think we can get the job done? Is it a problem? If it isn't a problem, you check the box and you go on. But I like to say this to people. You should have this question around this too. You should say, well, what if one of us leaves? What if one of us quits the company? Do we know how to replace that person? So that's the other conversation you need to have. That's why that checklist item is there. So another one, Team Alpha form, checklist item. All team members understand how to perform their work. I love this one because, okay, does that mean everybody's got to really, the team, I know how to do my work. This new person comes in on the project, they may not know how to do the work. So does that mean the project's dead? No, of course not. We have new people, and sometimes when they come in, they don't know how to do their job. The team gets together and says, so-and-so, can you get with me and help me? So we help new people when they come in. Again, this is getting the team to figure out what's the right thing to do. It's not like saying you can't move forward. As long as we're dealing with it and somebody's helping someone else, you're fine. All right? So another one. Stakeholder, alpha, represented state. Checklist item, the stakeholder representatives have agreed to take on their responsibilities. Frequently, you have stakeholders that aren't showing up or they're not taking on their responsibilities. So what do? The answer is the team's got to talk about it. Again, context. Is this a problem? This is that context with respect to problem solving. Is this stakeholder important? So if it's a minor stakeholder, it's not going to affect the success of the project, you move on. If it's a key stakeholder, and this key stakeholder is not accepting their responsibilities, you'd better do something about it. This again is what we mean by, think about your context when you look at these checklist items. You have options. When you look at the checklist items, you have multiple choices. A team can first, you discuss it, and you take an action. You agree we need to do something, right? And what you do with that action depends on your methodology. We're methodology and practice independent. So whether you feed this action into some action item system or some daily stand-up, if you're doing script, blah, it depends on your context to decide what to do with it. You may discuss it and say it's just not applicable to us, it's not a problem, and you move on. That's an okay thing to do. Or you may decide you need to raise a risk. And this is an issue, we don't know how to solve it, so you deal with it by at least documenting the risk or using your risk system. So those are some common questions, and those are the ways to handle it. So we're back to the one we started talking about earlier. Why isn't risk an alpha? Common question we get. And again, as I said earlier, we could have made risk an alpha. We chose, and you can still add it as an alpha. We know risks exist, they're universal. But the fact is, you can think of the whole essence framework as a risk framework. And if you think about it from this standpoint, risk is everywhere. When you do an assessment, you can achieve these states. You eventually get to a state where somebody says, we can't get there because this checklist we can't mark. Now, if you decided it's not important, fine. But if you get to a checklist item and you don't know how to deal with it, and it is a big issue, it's a risk. So this framework leads you to find your risks. It is, so we really, in a sense, have risk in the model. We didn't need to add another alpha. If you want to add another alpha, go for it, but you don't need to do it. I'll say one other thing about this before Carlos can say what I said. I have a friend, Tim Lister, who wrote a book called Waltzing with Bears. And he wrote it with Tom DeMarco. And Tom and Tim also wrote a famous book like 15 years ago. It was one of the first books that came out in the last 20 years that really looked at the people issue. It's called Peopleware. And Tim and I had some discussions about this. And Tim said, he's big, Waltzing with Bears is a risk management book that DeMarco and Tim wrote. And Tim goes, he goes, my vision is that at some point in time, we're going to stop calling it risk management because it's just management. If you're managing your program, you're doing risk management every day. So we shouldn't even refer to it as risk management. Now, my vision is, and I've had this discussion with Ivar, in fact, when we were in Jacksonville before an OMG meeting, we were out to dinner, because I always have this in the back of my head, and I said, Ivar, if we're successful, and we get the world converted to Essence, and everybody's using it, do they need to know? Do they need to say, if somebody walks up to them, that you're using the Essence framework? And Ivar said no. And that was the answer I wanted to hear, because that's my vision. My vision is, 20 years from now, you'll all be thinking this way. You'll have the model in the back of your head, and you'll just communicate this way. And people will wonder why we always didn't do software this way, because it just makes sense. And it's a model that's been missing. And one day people will figure out and go, why weren't we always doing this? To get value out of the software system, it's got to run on hardware. Software by itself can't bring value. You got to have a piece of hardware for it to run on. So you see these dependencies. There are dependencies in there. So you need the hardware to get the software system to bring value to the customer. We're always looking for value. It's how to be successful.
Bueno, el asunto de lo que...
So I've gone through you've seen all the pieces, and so you've got the basics of it. This is I told you I was going to break this into 3 pieces. This is the second piece. I got your question. And you said the enterprise. Just say a little bit more what you meant by the enterprise here.
When I say the enterprise, I mean big money enterprises, for example.
Say it again. I didn't catch
Big money enterprises, for example, implement big projects across 2 years, 3 years, and they need to use heavy resources.
Big projects.
Not only big projects. I think the question is related to the way in which we sell this environment to the companies, to the software companies, who works day by day in developing software or this kind of thing.
So I believe that the way you sell it, and there's different ways to come about that. I'm just going to give you my impression and the way I would do it. I really feel strongly that the benefit, and even though there's a lot of people out there seeing benefits in various areas, I really feel the strength of this model is at the small team practitioner level. Literally, like, I mean, Scrum's taken off. Obviously, everybody, it's like one of the biggest things in software in a long time. But what we see is how Essence can hit that same group that can help these Scrum teams be successful. Because as successful as Scrum is and how popular it is, you can go out and read all kinds of stories about failed Scrum teams. You know, they're not all succeeding. It's popular, but now it needs a little more. In other words, because we were so heavyweight for so long, Scrum has been this relief, and a lot of people have jumped on the bandwagon, but they're realizing that there needs to be some discipline in there, a little more structure. And I think that's the value add that Essence can bring. And when you look at this too, I mean, there's an incredible amount of software going on with these small teams. Even I have huge programs, but they're now doing it with, they've got hundreds, even thousands of developers, but they're saying we all want them to work in small 7 to 9 group Scrum teams, and they're breaking it all down. But then the question is, how do we coordinate all this? How do we make sure the software pieces are going to come together, they have appropriate architecture? So Scrum is big, and in a sense, I'm not saying Essence is just about that. This is one area that you can really sell Essence. Okay, these organizations are all going to Scrum, talking to senior management. How are you going to make sure that they don't throw away the baby with the bathwater? All of a sudden, are you still doing the disciplined engineering that needs to be going on? This framework can, in a very light, agile way, can bring that assurance back. And I think that's a big seller to organizations. Not the only one, but it's one. Am I getting to your question?
Yeah.
I see this with executives in big companies, that if we let them go agile, we're going to lose control. How do they ensure some structure and control? So I think it's as much of a sale to the senior executives to say that Essence is bringing some of the structure. I found in my business, oddly enough, my CMMI business has increased because of Agile and Scrum. Because some companies are going, I'll let your teams use Scrum, but only if you get a CMMI level 3, because that will give me some confidence that you've got structure there. So my CMMI business is literally on the heels of the Scrum movement has grown. I see that as a pathway for Essence as well, because I think Essence can help keep CMMI implementations at the right weight. Because too many organizations go overboard with the CMMI and the heavyweight answers.
Sí, yo creo que la respuesta.
I'm going to start with a couple of examples that are right out of our user's guide that, again, we're going to be releasing, hopefully by the end of this year. And the first one is a scenario where a team could be using any methodology they want. They could be using Scrum, they could be using a more heavyweight approach with the rational unified process. It doesn't matter. And this scenario walks you through and shows a team how they can use the cards to assess where they're at, see if they have any issues, and figure out where they are. We call it basically assessment poker. How many people have heard of planning poker?
¿Quién ha oído del póker de la planeación?
So this is a similar idea, but instead of using planning poker cards are used for the team to reach their assessment of how complex certain tasks are. This is about the same thing, only we're going to use the team, we're going to give each person on the team a deck of cards, and they're going to assess where we think we are. And so what we do is if you have a team, and keep this in mind, any team, again, no matter what methodology you're using, can do this, and they can do it at any point in their program, right? So everybody's got a deck of cards. They could be doing this in a retrospective, for example, and they just go through the alphas. Somebody leads it, whether you pick the first alpha, doesn't matter which one you pick. Let's start with this alpha, and then everybody take their deck of cards and look at the states, and look at the checklists, and just figure out where you think we are. And so we have a quiet time now, and then the leader eventually says, is everybody ready? And so each individual, let's say we had picked requirements, they would go through and they would look at each of the states, and they would think, okay, have I achieved the concede state? They look at the checklist items and they think about it. Each team member is doing this independently. Finally, they get to some state where they go, there's a checklist item. I don't think we've achieved that. So what that means, as soon as you find a checklist item you haven't met, that means you're at the previous state. The first state where you hit them all is the state you're in. You're not in the one you haven't. So is everybody ready? They go, all right, now show your cards all at the same time. And this is important that we do it this way for the same reason as assessment poker. Everybody puts the card up. And you look around and see if everybody agrees we're in the same state. And if there's disagreement, then you look at two people and you go, well, why don't you think we achieved the next state? And this person talks about the checklist item that we didn't hit, and you say, why don't you think we've achieved it? And over here, you said we were in that state, so you must have thought we achieved it. Why? So you generate conversation. And this is the big thing. This is generating conversation around the team, where they think we are, right? And through the process, we reach consensus on where we are. Now, if we have disagreements, I'm going to show you another scenario where a team had a disagreement and another technique to use. Again, using essence in a different way, but using the activity spaces. But so, what I want you to get out of this is a couple of things. Planning poker is a big thing, but planning poker is just estimating. There's no other techniques out there for a team to look at the big picture, all of the dimensions. We typically, software, we're just talking about this in a break, software developers think about developing code and getting their tests to run. And often in retrospectives and planning sessions using Scrum, you see teams doing the same thing. You don't see them talking about the other alphas. So this brings a different level of dimension to the discussion the team is having. And the other thing it does is frequently you'll see teams, when they start to get together and have discussions, there's a few people that dominate the discussion, and some people are quiet and they never talk. And this is a way to elicit the discussion from everyone. Because if somebody's quiet and they don't talk, and they have to put up their card, and if they're one of the outliers, you'll look at them and you go, why do you think you're there? And you get the quiet people to talk. And frequently the quiet people have something really good to say. You can't get it out of them, right? So, and again, what I want you to remember, this isn't just for Scrum or iterative. It doesn't matter. Anybody could use this technique. It's independent of method. The next scenario I want to talk about, and I like this scenario for a number of reasons. It's one which starts with a problem. And this scenario, there's a team and they're out building some software. I don't need to go into whole details here, but they have a resistant stakeholder. And so the team says, well, what can we do about it? Well, we're going to play another game with this. And what I really like about this, when I told you earlier, I'm a Lean Six Sigma black belt. I spent hundreds of hours studying to take the exam and do all this, learn all these great techniques, and I like this stuff. but they're, most developers don't become Lean Six Sigma black belts, but they need to have techniques to dig in and find root causes and fix them, which is a lot what Lean Six Sigma is about. We got a problem, let's dig in, figure out where the problem is, let's make sure it's right by measuring, and then let's fix it. The scenario I'm about to describe shows how a team, without going through Lean Six Sigma black belt, can use natural language, use the language of essence, and do their own root cause analysis. And so what happens with this scenario, we start out and we know we've got this resistant stakeholder. So what's the first thing that happens? Well, okay, where do we start? Well, what would be the obvious alpha to look at first? How about stakeholders, right? Let's look at the stakeholder alpha and see where we're at. So since we have a resistant stakeholder, the group takes the 6 state cards and they line them up and we look at them. Here's all the states, the 6 states of stakeholder. And the team together says, where are we? So we kind of play just with this one, with this alpha, we play the same game that we did with the last scenario to figure out where we're at. And when the team discusses this, they reach the conclusion that we have achieved the recognized state, but we haven't achieved the represented state. Now the recognized state, if we get in and look close, what that's saying is the stakeholder groups have been recognized. So we know who the groups are, but we haven't yet appointed a representative, because stakeholder representatives recognizes the fact that in a lot of projects, you can't have all the stakeholders there, so you have to get somebody that represents the stakeholder groups. And all of a sudden they realize we have this resistant stakeholder, but there's no representative of the group they're from, so we've got to get a representative. So they immediately get an action and they go out and they talk about it, and the first conclusion is, why don't we just pull in the resistant stakeholder? This is an obvious person. Okay, we get that. Let's get him in. Then the next one is, you have to figure out the next state after represented is involved. So we've got him appointed. They go through the action of getting this individual appointed, but now they have to make sure he's involved. Does he understand what his responsibilities are? In order to do this, they bring him in and they interview him. And they talk to him and say, what's the problem? What's going on here? Well, as they do that and they discuss it, they find out this stakeholder just does not see the value in the new software system. He's using an old software system that they're trying to replace. He likes it. And so the team recognizes, we got to figure out a way to show this stakeholder the value of the system. Well, as you work through this scenario, what you see, we move from alpha to alpha. And in each alpha, the discussion leads to action items. And eventually it leads to the fact that they realize that it goes to the opportunity alpha, because the opportunity alpha says, show me the value. And then they figure out, well, how can I show them the value? Well, we've got to demonstrate the software system. It leads back to the software system alpha and the demonstrable system. So you're led through this chain of alphas doing root cause analysis, finding ways to resolve the problem. And that's essentially what you see here. The team discussion leads you through these paths of the alphas, and eventually they do a demonstration to the resistant stakeholder of the software system, showing him the value, and the stakeholder goes, oh, I see what it's going to do for me. So the neat thing about this whole scenario is, pick a problem. One of the things I like about this, and this goes back to the questions we talked about earlier, why 7 and how good are the 7? Pick a problem. Try to find a problem. Just make one up and see if you can't figure out the first alpha to go to. We haven't been able to find a problem that isn't almost obvious. And that's really powerful when you think about it. I didn't have to teach you Lean Six Sigma to do this. It's natural language. It's just logical. Practitioners get it.
Bueno, lo más importante...
Move on to the third example. This again is out of the user's guide. And this is one where we're going to use the activity spaces. And This is an example where teams can use the activity spaces to self-assess. Are we doing what we ought to be doing? Now, we put the word ought there. It was actually real thought process here, because we're not telling you what you ought to be doing. We're asking the team, do you think you're doing the right activities? Are you doing what you think you ought to be doing? And one of the interesting, I'll give you a real simple way you can play a game with the activity spaces, is you can just pull the team together and go, here's the 15 activity spaces. We'll walk through them and just look at the names of them. They're very generic kinds of activities. So we're not getting into any method yet. And you just put up 1, 2, or 3 fingers where one says, 1 is we're not doing okay, we're doing poor. 2 fingers means we're doing okay, and 3 fingers means we're doing great. And you just go around the room and you play the game real quick. And what immediately it does, it's a different view now. Instead of using the alphas, the activity spaces are a little bit higher level view because you're not going down to all the checklists. But it's a way for the team to just quickly kind of say, are we doing the right things? Because what can come out of this, you can play this game in 5 minutes. And some team members are going, we're really not doing blah, blah, blah. I'm going to give an example of that in a minute. But it's a real quick way. And by only using the 3 fingers, some people have said, don't we need to be more precise about this? Can we just 3 levels? I don't know if people know who Warren Buffett is. But he's like Warren Buffett is like one of the richest men in the world, and he's great at picking stocks. And the only reason I bring him up is one of his quotes. It says, I would rather it's better to be approximately right than precisely wrong. And when you're talking about activities and practices, teams need to be a little looser here. Just, give me your gut sense. Are we doing what we ought to be doing? So the 3 fingers actually works better than being more precise in trying to figure out where we're at. Right? So let me just talk now about what this team did. That's one simple way to do this. We have another scenario in there where, and I mentioned this before, where the team has a differing opinion of the alpha state they got to. What do you do when 2 people disagree about the alpha state we got to? Well, you can switch to the activity view. And we have a scenario in there where, in this particular case, 2 team members disagreed with the state we were in terms of the way of working. And so they went back and they laid out the way of working cards. And when they were doing it from the alpha view, they noticed one of the junior, this team had selected Scrum. I should say that first. And and that was the only practice they had. And the question was whether they had achieved the foundation established way of working. One of the checklists in there is key practices and tools ready. So the question became, do we have all the key practices we need? We're doing Scrum. One of the inexperienced people said, no, I don't think we have enough practices. So they couldn't get to the agreement when they looked at it from the alpha view. So they went to the activity view to generate discussion. And the interesting thing that happens in this scenario is they walk through the activity view of the endeavor space. They start having the discussion around first coordinate activity. And they ask the question of the team, how are we doing at coordinating? And okay, we said we're doing Scrum. How do we coordinate under Scrum? Well, we should be holding our daily stand-ups. And as the discussion unfolds, they realize they're not really doing that as well as they should be. And then they ask about support the team. Okay, how are we doing at supporting the team? This is a really good discussion because in this one, the junior, the less experienced engineer says, I really don't know how to do my job. I need help. I think you need to give me better practices. And a more experienced developer goes, that's my fault. I was supposed to mentor you. I really need to get to you, but I've just been busy. So they realize, okay, this may not be a practice problem. Maybe the team needs to be working together. And the last one is track the progress. how are we doing at tracking the progress? And a couple of them raised the one finger and they go, we're not doing well, we're not really doing our burn down charts. We said we were.
En la lista de chequeo.
We're going to move on to competencies. So if there's any lingering questions on activity spaces, this would be the time to ask them. Anything about there, we're ready to move on.
Preguntas sobre espacios de actividad.
Competencies. This, as you recall, I said in the introduction, this is one of the areas I really think this can help the software engineering community, because I think we haven't got the attention of a number of competencies. And I already talked to you a little bit about leadership and management. The whole idea of the competencies, again, stimulate discussion, goes back to the thinking framework, help you solve problems. You can ask the question, do the assigned people have the needed abilities? So again, a team can use this to generate discussion. I put one there. I don't have a scenario on it. But here's the suggestion of it. Really read all of the words, because these were thought through in all of the 6 competencies, because it will generate discussion. What we suggest you do is, if you're going to use the activity spaces, the group should really carefully read the words and what's going on there. And I put analysis there. As I mentioned, I believe the 4 that we can really help with are stakeholder involvement. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. There's stakeholder representation, analysis, and then leadership and management. Stakeholder or analysis, I put the words there. This competency encapsulates the ability to understand opportunities. Now you think of analysis. Typically analysis, this has to do with breaking down requirements and making sure you have the right requirements. And a lot of people, a lot of companies, they may be doing shall statements, or maybe they're doing use cases, or today in Scrum they're doing user stories. But here's the thing. Are we looking at the opportunity? Understanding the opportunity and their related stakeholder need. What's the stakeholder really need? So are these requirements the right requirements for the stakeholder need? This kind of gets into validation of requirements. And transform them into, here's that word, one of the key words, agreed and consistent set of requirements. So the analysis competency, someone making sure the requirements that are being generated are agreed to by, again, I'm going back, by who? Depends on your context. There's some important people that need to agree to the requirements. Now the example I like to use here, again, I work with a lot of big companies, and there's these people that are called the analysts. They're doing the requirements analysis, and they work with tools like doors, and they spend their whole life. You go in and talk to them, and they're experts in this tool doors, but they don't talk to anybody. You go back and you read this competency. Does that person have the right skills? They think all it's about is breaking down requirements and putting them in doors and doing traceability, and they're not even talking to the stakeholders or communicating to make sure we're putting the right requirements in. This is a big problem in a lot of projects, where we start building software systems to requirements, but they don't map back to the real problem, the need.
Bueno,
So we're down to 5 minutes. I'm going to kind of do a quick run through of some high-level points that if we had another 2 hours, I would do. Right? So another thing you can do with activity spaces is, suppose a team has used Scrum, right? If a team has used Scrum, you can go in and you can look for gaps. So do we need better practices? Maybe I don't have a test practice, but the question is, do I need it? Did the team need a test practice? So you can just ask yourself if we need better practices. You can also look for gaps and overlap, gaps and overlaps. Do we have too many practices in certain areas? So you can assess your practices. That's one thing you can do. You can also, as I mentioned before, you can add hints and you can add more checklists. So I already made that. So now what I'm going to do real quickly, this is the third part of the discussion. This is where I was going to get you to think a little outside the box. And the question is, where can Essence help more? At the start, at retrospectives or somewhere in between. There was a study done, there were some pilot projects done out at Carnegie Mellon West with Cecile Pereira, and some of her students used Essence, and one of the conclusions that came back is it helped at the start, but they said, well, once the project got going, we didn't see as much help. And if I had been there, I would have asked this question: did you have any problems? Because if you didn't have problems, the best thing Essence can do is don't get in your way, all right? So maybe they didn't have problems, but if they did have problems, did they know enough how to use it, like I was explaining? So where I was going to go with this is, can it help when things are going well or not so well? What about when you have a tough decision to make, right? I believe this is one of the best places it can help if we understand how to apply it in this way. Partly is the checklists, but what I was going to do here is I was going to explain to you an idea, and this is actually in my latest book, an idea of what I call practice slices and patterns. You can define practices on top of the kernel, but you can also define patterns. Pattern is just this simple, the way to think of it is just a simple slice of a situation. And if you can remember the situation and you can remember your options, then you can train people in little snippets of practices. And I believe this is the way to go, because if you look at what we've done historically, is when people go into big companies, they get the stone tablets, they get the monolith of all the processes, and it's just too hard to use it. And practitioners have come back and said, this stuff doesn't help me. I'm trying to get the world to turn this around and get companies to stop saying to their practitioners when they come out of school, here's the way we want you to operate, and treat your developers like your customer. You're the customers of the processes. Listen to the developers, what they need, and then start giving them the help that they really need. What this leads to is practices that are a vehicle to help practitioners perform better. And you can do this, and I think everybody wants to go there, but there's this struggle in the world right now between how you get there. Because what we used to do is the extreme heavyweight, very big processes. And then there was the more lightweight processes, which didn't help either. The answer is in between. Now this slide, this is the slide that I would have talked to you about with the two views of the cards. And this is where we're going with practices. I told you about Essence. Essence is down here. That's the kernel. We're now going to have a card deck that sits on top, which is your practices and your patterns. You can have a set of cards. They will sit on top. And then the other thing is, what are the things to watch out for? And these are another set of cards to help you with scenarios. And the way to do this is not for us, not for consultants to come in and tell you where to go, but to bring your people together and ask them, where's your pain? Where do you need help? And then use your experts to say, how would you solve this problem? And capture that. I've done this with some of my clients. And by the way, a lot of this material that I'm sharing with you now is my new thinking. And a lot of it's in my latest book that just came out last month. In fact, all of it in this section comes out of there. So I have a lot of the scenarios I was going to talk to you about come out of that. But this is an example of taking a user story form and abstracting out simple stories that come from the developers. And there's 3 examples here. I'm not going to go through them now because we don't have time. But they're simple user stories of the typical things that developers need help with. I don't understand a requirement. It's ambiguous. I can't get my stakeholders to work with me. All of a sudden, my testing is taking too long. I'm getting pressure to release my software. I want to handle, all of a sudden I realize I have a design risk and there isn't time. What do I need to do? Do I need to pull in and have a peer review? These are the questions developers have. This idea of practice slices, what it does is it captures the knowledge of the right way to solve these things and makes it of value to the developer because this is what they need. So to complete a pattern, what I would have done, I'd walk through these things with, you also complete the pattern by giving the options and the added questions. And so when you add in the options and additional questions, you're letting the practitioner know that they have choices. Again, it goes back to the thinking framework. you can make choices here. And so here I was going to walk through some of the options. Some of these things sound obvious, but this goes back to the point, it's the obvious stuff that we miss that turns into a problem later. So the last three scenarios in here, and I'm just going to share with you, I picked three of them out of here in this presentation to show three different things. And one of them shows a typical situation where a practitioner has to make a decision, he has to make it quick, and he's under stress. And this is common today because on a lot of our projects we have very aggressive schedules, and we may not have perfect requirements, and we have to make decisions. How do you make the decision under stress? So the first one, and what I do in this scenario, is I show the problem, and then we look at it through the lens of essence. What are the relative, what are the alphas of relative, and then you use the checklists to help you make a decision, right? Because it's giving you that context. That's the first scenario. The second scenario I was going to talk to you about is one that's a simple scenario. I call it, also in here I had a bunch of different ways you can fall back. For people who don't believe it's just a waterfall model. So the next one is a scenario I call a little coaching at just the right time. And this is just a simple scenario that shows where, and by the way, these last three scenarios are all real cases that I've gone through with my clients. In this one, it was a company I went into, and they decided to move from a traditional waterfall model to a Scrum approach. I gave them training, and then they went out, and they all thought they knew what they were doing, but they didn't. They went back to their old habits. And the whole point of the scenario was we then looked at where the problem was, we look at which alphas are relative, the team alpha, where are they, way of working, and then you say, all right, all they really needed was a little coaching. But the point that I want to make to this, a lot of companies just think, well, if I'm doing Scrum, I just need to get a couple coaches in. How do you keep your coaches on the same page? You want your coaches to be coaching in some level of consistency. So this scenario shows some of the thought process to get coaches on the same page. The last scenario I was going to talk to, and this is my favorite, it's called the ZAP project. And this is the scenario that I love to tell people about to help people understand the difference between opportunity and requirements. Because a lot of practitioners don't get the difference between opportunity and requirements. And this is a true story, and it was a story that I tell, if we had time, I'd walk you through this, but I tell the story about this guy, Dave, who's a real person I worked with, that he sounds like a horrible manager because of the way he's doing things that sound like they're off the cuff. He's missing meetings. He's like harebrained. He's not following the company processes. But as you walk through the scenario and then we look at it from the essence view, what you find out is that Dave is a true leader. And this is where I will explain why leadership is important. Because what he's doing is he's recognizing that the opportunity is at risk. And it's at risk because, and this can happen, there's an opportunity. What an opportunity means is the need, and somebody's there funding it, and they have a certain vision, but sometimes the requirements grow way out of control. And this kills programs. And what Dave was doing was he was working the opportunity. Sometimes, just working the requirements is not enough to save it. He was working the opportunity, and he was also leading the team, inspiring them to get the right piece of work done, so whenever the customer would come in, they could demo and he could keep the project alive. So what you'll learn in this scenario is there's a huge difference between opportunity. It has to be managed, and it's managed separate from requirements. And you also learn the importance of leadership, because a lot of projects lack good leaders, people who can inspire and motivate a team. That's what leadership is about, and you need that. It's distinct from management. So to conclude this, I'll just jump to my last slide if I can get there. The second to last one. In summary, essence does not replace what your team is doing today. Remember that. You can use this. You go in and decide to use Essence. Whatever you're doing, if it's working, fine. We don't want you to change your method. This is something to help power whatever you're doing today. It's an aid to critical thinking. That's the way I like to. I'll go back to my friend who said it gives you great context for problem solving. I really think that's the power of it. It helps you assess where you're at, helps you focus on what's most important, and helps you make better decisions. We need this. It's been missing for a long time. And I am still a firm believer that one day people will all be doing this and they'll be wondering, why did we ever do software any different? They will not be able to remember a time when we didn't use it. That's my vision for this. So with that, I'm finished.
Okay. Paul, thank you so much. Thank you so much for letting me share this stage with you. I think it was a good experience for me to join this effort.
I enjoyed it as well. I thought it was great. Thanks for collaborating.
Thank you so much. Un aplauso nuevamente para Paul.
La práctica de software. Práctica de software es un concepto común en ingeniería de software.
In many contexts, and he's interested in knowing what is the definition of practice from the point of view of the Essence kernel, and what this definition is reconciled with the several approaches leading with practices.
Okay, so first off, in the latest revision of the OMG, they actually made a mistake. And I've already submitted the request to fix this, and it's the definition of a practice. They tweaked it the wrong way, and they made it sound like a practice is a definition. But then the definition of the practice becomes the definition of a definition, and so that won't work. A practice, our definition is, and we're putting it back, it's a repeatable approach to doing something with a specific purpose in mind. That's our definition of practice. Now, this are what a lot of companies used to call processes, right? And a lot of companies that use the CMMI still use the word process. But the whole idea of practice is what are the things, the activities that we want you to do, and what's the goal? Helping people do their job. That's what the practice is about. That's what processes are about. We're trying to define them within the CNET Essence context. We actually, a practice can be in any area. You can have a practice that focuses on testing, a practice that focuses on development. But the structure that we're suggesting is, again, very simply to build them with cards, so that they're cards on top of cards. But there's what we call the fundamental cards, the basics, and then there's the cards about what to think about when you're executing. So there's these two different, if you think about this, you're only a beginner for a short period of time. And what a lot of the companies have done with the heavyweight documents is they focused on telling you everything you need to know, and a lot of it you already know. And so you can't find what you need to know because of all the stuff that you already know. So what we're doing is we use a phrase, separation of concerns. We're separating out so that you can get to what you need when you need it. If you're a beginner, we have cards that are for the basics. What is this practice about? The description of it. What is the entry criteria? What do you have to do before you get in it? So there's some basic stuff you have to know. But once you get into it, what's key is to have, again, checklists. So the essence of our what to do when you're into practice are a set of checklists or things to watch out for. And things to know, we have to get through this checklist to know the practice, we've completed the goal. So we're going with checklists, just like inside the kernel, there'll be checklists for the practices. Now, there's another point I bring out about practices, which is a big issue of mine, is there's two ways to use the word practice, as a noun and a verb. And the noun practice is what I just described. The verb side is you have to practice your practices to learn how to do them well. And it's important that we don't forget that. And I think this gets into the discipline of becoming good at your practices. It's like anyone, I use the analogy of people in sports have to practice all the time to get good. It's true in software development as well, but we don't focus on that. And we need to be doing more of that, recognizing both the verb side of practice, the action, as well as the noun, the description of it.
Ok, bueno, pues la respuesta de Paul fue la siguiente.